Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Kellimar audiobook, episode 5. I am your host, Nobody, presented to you by New Ithaca Podcast. When we last left Kellimar, he had just gotten done discovering the fact that his father was no more than a pile of bones in a dungeon. The woman that he had considered himself in love with had abandoned him and sent him to the wind. Though he did one last thing to gain vengeance, he took a book of spells, a book of change. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, as we continue our odyssey and adventure into the future of Kellimar. Part 2. When the Wolves Howl. Vampire Myths of Realities, Volume 1, Section 8. Then, the last creation of the Elder God was formed. Thus came into existence the Dark Queen Nyx, who could ensnare even the stoniest of hearts in her deathly pale clutches. She managed to cause far more destruction than any other celestial before her with this charm. This great power was irresistible to all but one creator. This creator was the last-born celestial of Gaia. Refer to Section 2 for the detailed execution of Gaia, who had been butchered personally by her son Chaos. Nyx persisted with every ounce of power her charm possessed, but her motives were in question for our creator. So he turned her away and asked her not to bother him with such nonsense again. She furiously vowed an unbreakable promise that she would force the creator to kill himself like his faction had done before him. After many long battles and even more casualties, Nyx managed to find our creator's brother. Chaos was a well-known champion of the cleansers, only known and respected for his limitless power, which was only matched by his limitless cruelty. Unlike his estranged brother, however, his power could only bring destruction. Nyx ensnared him into her web, as she had done to so many before, but seeing the endless cycle as a grand waste of energy, she forged a plan with this new tool at hand. She forced him to kill every other celestial in existence except for his brother, to prove he truly was a champion. The boastful celestial took her challenge, and thus began the great slaughter. Chaos managed to destroy every last celestial, one by one, until all that was left were the Creator, Nyx, and Chaos himself. Nyx herself managed to imprison the Elder God. It is still unknown by what means, though legend has it that he is imprisoned in a powerful artifact that imbues the user with the Elder God's once limitless power. Perhaps it has been lost for the best. The Celestials had done little but cause a hellish, endless suffering for all. Yet now it was left to these 3 remaining beings to decide the fate of existence. Nyx fought for silly reasons and destroyed everything time and time again, without pause or reflection. The Creator worked tirelessly on, doing his best to ignore the lonesome reality he'd been forced into by his brother, while Chaos continued to chase Nyx's affection for eternity to no avail. It's now the final battle, our final chapter, of which we, the Vampire, are responsible for the fate of our own preservation, desperately trying to hold together what we, the expendable creations, built from the rubble. Written and collected by the esteemed librarian and prince, Vladicus, son of King Vimnir, father of Prince Kellimar. Chapter 5. I stepped outside and felt the cold air on my thin face. It was blowing west, so I walked west. I traveled for a long, lonely time after that. I went to my first home, to that small cave my first years had been spent. I walked down to the village and saw that a city had been built. Stone structures where the wooden shacks had been, a great chapel where the fire pit had burned. It was abandoned, however, destroyed mostly, in some war or other the humans were waging. I found several burnt piles of bodies, and to my surprise, a few were impaled on a pike. I didn't stay long. I never stayed long. Eventually, after wandering west for an uncounted amount of time, I found the Atlantic Ocean, and rather than swim to the island of Britannia off in the distance, I made camp. From then on, for a long time, all I would do was practice magic and hunt for humans fishing along the coast. It was a lovely place to stay for a long while, but a day came when doing the same routine grew tiresome, and yet again I had to move on. 20 years had come and gone, and the beach I'd been using for a home had lost its scratchy appeal. For a fifth of a century, I had been practicing spells and internal abilities on these seldom crossed shores. In many areas, the sand had blackened with patches of glass from the aftermath of pyro manipulation. In others, new rock formations lay as I had ripped them from their tombs below. The tide flowed as I wished it to, and the waves crashed as high as I commanded. The only element I hadn't mastered was air. The book spoke of incredible feats of flight and spiraling cycles of death that could touch the sky. However, all I could muster was a strong wind. I stood looking over the crashing waves, creating beautiful 20-foot arches that would smash the rock formations to pieces. I would then carelessly raise more boulders before once again tearing them down. It was almost automatic, like a child mindlessly playing with its feet. I looked down at my palm and let a bit of fire dance between my fingers. Magic was alluring, but had its costs. It felt almost painful, and I had to fight hard to keep the monster within from emerging. My time in isolation had also taught me the curse of my decision. My abilities were amusing and time-consuming, but the constant pain throughout my circulatory system was torture. One of the many aspects of the discipline I had to learn during these solitary decades was keeping the clawing monster at bay. Yet the beast never stopped trying. For a long time I hated the thing, the part of me that was hardy. I hated it, and I hated her for casting me out. Time had only made my bitterness grow and strengthen. After weeks of waiting, the monthly merchant ships, white sails lifted high like a great bird spreading its wings. The ship was still dozens of kilometers away, yet I needed what I needed. The sea smelled bitter with salt and decay. I took a deep breath of the intoxicating scent and dove into the shallow water, carefully avoiding the glass. No need to ruin good art. The water was strong, but with a simple phrase, I calmed the great force of nature into gentle tapping waves. At least until I swam close enough to the boat to be seen by the sailors aboard. When I came within human sight, someone screamed, "Man overboard!" The men on the ship immediately began toiling to retrieve me. To throw them off balance, I made the waves lurch higher and crash viciously around their vessel. To be as convincing as possible, I made my movements more panicked and began screaming for help, splashing the surface of the water and sinking back in as though I were nearly overcome with exhaustion. A large red-headed man tied a rope around his waist and shoulders and dove into the cold water. He swam quickly, and soon had his arm around my chest. 3 men above were pulling the 2 of us up the building-sized ship. The fungus-smelling man held tightly to me, but felt inclined to make his opinion of me known. "Don't know where you're from there, Moore, but you won't be finding peace with us. Lucky we're about to dock, or I'd let you drop." I cut out his throat swiftly and let the red delicacy pour into my parched mouth. I wouldn't want to eat the filthy creature's flesh, but its blood was a blessing after so many years of shark and whale. After the first decade, the fishermen had stopped fishing near my shore, with legends sprouting and humans avoiding it altogether. When we were dragged onto the ship, the first crewman who noticed tried to scream, but before he could, I made the water in his body freeze. His eyes went blank, and in an instant he fell to the ground. His skin had turned dreadfully dark blue. While I was learning to do more and more with magic, my abilities were still limited to only performing basic uses of elemental forces. It was frustrating to think I was only scratching the surface. I quickly grabbed the thin-bladed sword the frozen man had worn. Before the others noticed me, I ran my hand over the blade. A blue and black fire erupted along the thin metal as I sliced through the 3 crewmen still holding the rope. They hadn't even realized my savior was long since dead and hanging like a grotesque marionette doll. I let the rancid body fall into the water for the fish. Several of the crew witnessed this, which soon brought shouts and bells that began to blare all around. In less time than seemed possible, 50 or so soldiers dressed with elaborate coats and boots scuttled out of their small holes like ants facing a scorpion. Each held a sword and a pistol. I concentrated, feeling my unnatural thick blood fight through swollen veins and arteries. The pain of suppressing the beast made me clench my fists so furiously I shattered my phalanges. With a deep breath, I unclenched my mending fingers. When I opened my blue eyes once more, every single one of the crew's blood began to boil under their flesh, both above and below deck. It was a sonata of blood-curdling screams. It had only lasted 4 seconds or so, before they simply collapsed into endless silence. Steam lifting up from their mouths, noses, and eyes. Heat had been easier to control for me than extreme cold during my novice years. I gorged myself through a magnificent steamed feast, followed by the storage of several bodies in large blocks of saltwater ice. I forced the wind to lift the sails and turn the mast, controlling the ship's movement with a simple set of phrases and gestures. I forced the water below to speed along the ship towards the setting sun, sailing south along the coast once I had reached enough distance from the shore. I held the now brown note my brother had given Crimson all those years ago. I couldn't help but wonder if I should turn west and abandon this land forever. Still, if there was a chance I could convince my brother to abandon his anger, perhaps we could sail west until we found freedom from our past pain together. Perhaps I wouldn't be alone. I sailed far from the northern islands, far west and far south, towards my goal. When I could safely say I was near the bit of remote land I had been looking for, I began searching for the cave of black rocks and sharp stalactites. It took some time finding the particular cave I had remembered. Some 300 years prior, I had earned a meager wage sailing for some king or other. We had used the cave to hide from our enemies before they could overtake us and sink our ships. My bloodlust took over me one night, and there were no men left to tell tales when I was done. I waited for low tide and morphed the rocks into steel stilts to hold my ship upright on the sand. As I left the cave, I blocked the entrance by raising the sand and forming massive black cliffs to cover the gap completely. It would be weeks of uneventful travel on foot before I would reach my goal, where I would face my brother and either find forgiveness or find an enemy. I had trained with my book for the better part of 2 decades to ensure I would not have to kill him. I had tried to ensure my own life in case he had inherited our father's natural gifts. Through forests and mountains I trudged. Through storms and snow I fought my way to my kin. While I hadn't bothered to be quiet as I worked my way across the land, it still struck me as odd that I saw no other souls along my trail, not even birds or insects, and it became obvious something had changed about me since I had accepted the blood. It was as if every living creature was horrified of me, even though I hadn't changed back into that monster since I left that wretched cottage. Still, I preferred the silence to the various screechings and constant chatter I had known for centuries. After months of many long miles, it finally stood massive before me. The castle that my brother had christened his home was made of burnt, broken, blackened stone. It was crumbling in some places, and smelled of mold even from the road I stood upon. The walls around the structure had long since been battered by weather to the point of ruin. The gargoyles were missing limbs and heads as though remains from a long-forgotten battle. Large wooden pikes stood proudly from the side of the castle walls with impaled humans, some sun-bleached skeletons, some in the process of decay, and some fresh meat, still moaning for its last days of miserable life to end as they slid down the greased and bloody pole. I slowly made my way across a courtyard that was covered in untended trees. Weeds and spiky grass shot up from the ground like soldiers guarding a fort in war. This path of green led to the front steps where 2 oak and iron doors were splintered and battered open. I stepped through, and the smell of blood was overwhelming for me. I stepped almost into a dreamlike state to the scent. I don't think that's human blood. What the hell happened here? I asked aloud to the shadows before taking a deep breath. The shadows didn't respond. As I stared at one of the many towers that were now a pile of rubble, it all made me wonder. I looked down at the dark soil and pondered how many bones were scattered underneath. I then turned towards the scent once more and walked through the threshold, taking a long, deep breath to relax myself. When you live as long as I have, how can you still truly fear death? I said aloud as I took confident steps towards the sound of deep inhales. I couldn't see him, but I could feel his cold presence in the shadows around me. There are worse fates than death. Do you hear me, brother? Don't forget that, or you'll come to that lesson the hard way. His voice was low, and little more than a raspy hiss, yet I could hear my little brother's voice in that wretched croak. I continued onward, and could only slightly hear the sound of bats above my head. One in particular was massive compared to the others. The entrance hall was the size of a cathedral, with a ceiling clouded in darkness high above. Once elegant oak stairs covered in a red carpet sat decaying before me, now brownish tatters that led to a balcony that no longer existed. Portraits and landscapes were ruined by the elements and unrecognizable as paintings. Crumbled stones scattered across the dusty old floor, and at the center of the mess lay a large metal coffin with no lid. The smell of burnt flesh filled my nostrils and almost made me gag. I noticed that the coffin was cracked in several places. The cracks seemed to have snapped around in a spiral where chains had once strapped it down. The iron links were now snapped to pieces and rusted, laying scattered carelessly around the great sarcophagus. I could hear sniffing from far above. "Brother, you came." With that, a large hairless creature dove from several 100 feet high, all the way from the second story to the ground, cracking the black stone beneath him. Where dark brown skin should have smoothly been, only a shiny, cracked brownish gleam was visible. Large fleshy wings protruded from Thing's back. The only recognizable trait from my little tiny brother were his sky blue eyes, bloodshot and filled with mad rage. "Kellimar, did you know I was still alive when you and Father abandoned me? Did you know I was still breathing in the ash of others of our kind that had hidden near their king for safety? Did you even cry as the fire burned every inch of my pathetically small body? You abandoned me, you filthy bastard, and now you'll die." He flew around me with 3 powerful flaps, reaching with claws that resembled the talons of an eagle more than a hand. I didn't waste time yelling before turning into the beast, but the moment I did, my mind drifted from me, and I found myself trying to rip him from the air. I tried with everything I had to stop myself. I had no intention of hurting my brother, but something within me was taking control. With a leap and a swipe, my body seemed to be moving on its own, as my claw wrapped around my brother's ankle. Before I could tighten my grip on his massive clawed foot, however, he spun around and grabbed me by the forearm with his other talon. He snapped my shoulder and ripped the rest of my arm clean off, taking a chunk of bicep into his mouth. He grinned and let blood drip. "You know, Kelly, I'm the one who killed the rest of our kind. The night I crawled, burnt and broken from that pit, I found my way into the hut they'd been using to store our people's bodies. I devoured many corpses that night, Kelly. When the following day came and I hid amongst the dead, the change began. Wings, fangs, talons, all mixed with my unhealable burnt skin. It made me look like a demon. I flew off the following night with several body parts of our kind in a bag, Kelly. Then I tracked down living flesh using the scent of the dead. I found them, Kelly. The women and children that had been hidden by Father. I especially enjoyed eating the kids my own age or younger, Kelly. They had the juiciest meat. He took another deep bite of my arm before he continued. Your flesh is the first vampire I've had in centuries. Oh, I've missed the rush, Kelly. He stated before diving insanely quickly towards the crown of my skull. I dove out of the way, only to feel my entire body collapse under the effort. My flesh was still having trouble healing, not to mention if I didn't get my arm back, it would take weeks to grow another. I felt myself lift high into the air as my brother dug his fangs into my exposed neck. He began drinking deeply, and with each intake, my strength was sapped exponentially. I tried fruitlessly to stab at his temple with my claws, yet even pressing and slashing as vigorously as I could into his skull, I couldn't break his skin. He dug deeper into my throat, sending droplets of blood over my face and clothes. I could feel blood forming in my mouth, and almost out of pure instinct, I began to boil it. I let the black liquid leak from me, into his eyes, and he dropped both me and the arm instantly. When I was able to stand, I grabbed my arm and pressed it into the stub, letting it heal in place as I watched my brother wipe his face furiously, only managing not to fall out of the sky. The bitten flesh of my biceps soon healed, and I leapt against my will to meet my brother in the air. I twirled my large, dark paws, and a massive stream of blue fire burst forth with enough heat to melt a diamond. I couldn't stop it, and while I wanted more than anything to shout a warning, all I managed was a loud growl. The stream of flame slammed into his shoulder and singed his wing off instantaneously. He fell from the sky and landed roughly into the stone below, shattering every last one of his bones and stabbing almost all of his organs except for his brain from the sound and smell of him. I landed with a large crack in the stone floor appearing under my weight. I then unwillingly grabbed my brother by the foot and smashed him into a large stone column next to the staircase. I then held him up by his ankle, and with a slight gesture, I blasted him with my blue flames until there was nothing left but a shadow imprinted on the wall. I was breathing heavily for several seconds, while my broken bones put themselves back together slowly. I then collapsed to my knees as my body melted back into its normal state. I looked at the shadow imprint for days before I could move again. What have I done? Was all I asked myself over and over. I had lost control of the beast. It was separate from me. The lack of control, how powerless I had been. It terrified me. I found myself wandering the castle once I could stand again. Not all of the rooms were in decay, and while it wasn't ideal, I had nowhere left to go. I simply began to study the Black Book. The room I sat in was a library of rotting scrolls, all in a language I couldn't read. So there was little to distract me, but for the bats chittering in the dark. The runes spoke in a way. It wasn't the same as any other form of reading. I hadn't a clue what the runes meant, but they spoke and taught me just the same. Some runes spoke clearly and easily, others more whispered. The runes wanted me to understand, as though the book itself were the teacher. It spoke of molecular structure and the ways to morph them into new shapes. The book seemed to be telling me that I could rewrite reality if I learned the patterns. I set the book on the icy floor and ripped a chunk of stone from the chamber wall. I let the book guide me on what to say to loosen the molecules. It was a strange language, almost like the original Vampamese, but very different in the uses of sounds. I twisted the rock slowly and focused on one individual molecule. The structure of the atoms were intricate, yet I could feel the cracks that could be manipulated. I slowly pressed through these structural failures and shifted the atom's various components into separate categories of molecules. I then allowed the book to dictate how the structure of these separate molecules should form back together. The rock began to shake and glow slightly, but I continued my work. Hour by hour, day by day, I rewrote every last atom on that bit of matter. Until finally, I held a smaller piece of iron within my hand. The molecules hadn't been easy to form with the material available, but it was sufficient. I held the metal to my eye before letting it clatter to the chamber floor. I continued on like this for some time, turning rock into every element I had within my knowledge. After weeks of playing with my first act of molecular manipulation, it wasn't long before I could turn any bit of matter into any other at will. It was my first leap into the deeper complexities of magic, yet it would prove to be the most consistently valuable. I looked down at my dry and ashy hands. After nearly 3 years of isolation and starvation in my brother's tomb, it was time to explore the last chapters of my black book. Teleportation and the complexities of interdimensional magic. So I began to toil as Tahari once had, learning the most difficult and precise magic the book had to offer. For months I worked and worked until I understood. There was only one way to create a portal to the in-between. Only one way to find a home, or at least a quieter place to die. I began gathering ingredients until all that was left to find was fairy blood. I morphed tattered cloth into fine travel clothing before I walked away from what should have been my second chance. I still hadn't allowed myself to turn into the beast in all that time. I wasn't sure if I'd ever allow myself that power again. I looked one last time at the black shadow mark my brother had left, what I had reduced him to. I smashed my hand into the stone, and the wall crumbled away. I immediately felt remorse, but the anger and loss was too much. I slowly stepped away and toward the ship, far off to the coast I had once been so hopeful. The snow was thick and brutally cold under my feet. The tall pines smelled wonderful and still held their green glow through the dark, bitter wind. I took a deep breath and exhaled a long stream of fine mist before slowly moving to the next tree. The locals of whatever community the creature chose to torment usually just called him a spirit, a devil, or a demon, something to that effect. I knew the creature I was hunting as the Celts knew him, as a leprechaun. He enjoyed using his tricks to trap humans. I never confirmed what he did with them, but they'd never return. So I hunted the bastard island to island until he boarded a vessel to the north. I stalked the powdered trail, and my thoughts blurred into a deep focus. While I didn't think there was a chance to bring the lost children back, I knew I could pay the blood debt owed. As I jumped from branch to branch, I finally spotted the ideal location for an ambush. I hunched over my high perch and smelled deeply into the air, charging my fists with magic. The blanketed gray sky made me smile. A good hunt always brightened my mood. White flakes of snow slowly began to drift down from above like a grand dance of delicate crystals. I had only needed fairy's blood as my last ingredient to make the portal. I hadn't realized it would be so difficult when I had set sail from the mainland. While it took a great deal of time, I was able to find the little green monster stealing children, and even some foolish adults as well. I wouldn't have even bothered tracking this thing so far if fairies were easier to find. I had learned that whenever the creature shapeshifted into some other form, its magical aura was suppressed. But his eyes always gave him away. Lime green with purple irises, always the same color no matter what he morphed into. Even when he turned into a human to board ships, he couldn't hide his odd eyes, as they glowed under the brim of his hat when the sun sank into the horizon. The tree I rested in was far ahead of the leprechaun, yet I could see him stalking up the trail in the form of a great white wolf. He was sniffing the air, trying to catch my scent, In the end, I heard him chuckle and move on. He stretched and morphed back into his little green body. He was an ugly little thing. His bony spine stuck out like lumps of jagged rock. His teeth were dark yellow, and his nails were black. His smell was suffocating for my keen senses. I had to wear a rag over my face just to breathe. I watched him as he confidently stepped right on His foot hovered in midair. He looked down at my trap and chuckled, a little more high-pitched than before. "Nice try there, Kelly boy, but..." I dove down behind him and he jumped forward with a mid-air spin, completely startled. He then flipped up as the net closed around him, and with a wave of my hand, the iron mesh design tightened around him as well. I could see he was trying to transform, but my net did its work. "What have you done to me?" he growled, trying to bite through the tightly woven mineral. I waved my hand again and the net shocked him. "For hundreds of years, you've lured children from their homes. I should torture you, then eat you." The thought made me smile, munching on his lifeless corpse, but I enjoyed watching him squirm in fear more. "I know about your father. I know where he is, boy." It caught me by surprise, but I ignored his lies and just smiled sadistically down at him. I knew from experience the monster could peer into my mind. So do I. At the bottom of a dungeon. A pile of moldy old bones. Now enough talk. What should I do with you? Toss you in the ocean wrapped in my net and weights? Or maybe eat you one small bite at a time? Or maybe... Yeah, I like that. I'm shoving your rotten hide into a boiling vat of oil until the screams stop. Unless you tell me what you did with those children. His eyes shot open with fright as he fought frantically against the net. Without his powers, however, he only managed to tangle himself tighter into the mesh. "Yes, your father is dead, but his soul lives on, in the body of another. As for them, our deals were fair and clean. They received as they asked. I swear to Oberon." The fairy swirled as I started working on the portal. I ignored him and kept working, throwing 2 bags of ready ingredients for the spell. I then used my fingers to almost instantly make the appropriate runes in the dirt. In almost a minute, the shining purple glow began to appear, and the runes began to swirl into a blended circle. I cut open his arm and forced a pint of blood into the mix. His eyes fell for a moment, but he shook himself awake. "Oberon wanted immortality. He was and is dying of old age. He thought the secret was in your species' soul, and he tested his theory on his son. The young fairy became..." He was cut off. Bright gold tears streamed down his little face. I leaned in until I was only an inch away. "I only needed your blood. You're useless to me now." He screamed in rage and fought twice as vigorously, but the portal was done. I picked him up and stabbed the bone dagger into his heart. "I don't need help, but thanks for the information. I'll be sure to remember you fondly when I'm munching on the king of the Shadowlands." I twisted the dagger and yanked back out. With that, I dropped his limp corpse into the portal. But before I could close it, I dove in after him, venturing into the in-between. I felt it as I crossed, the slowing of time. For an immortal, time is nothing. Years are days. Days are seconds. Time loses its control and tends to slip away unnoticed when you live centuries. But the in-between was different. Time inched on at a snail's pace as I drifted slowly through the airless abyss. If I needed to breathe, I'd be dead. That still, oxygenless air was my home for what felt like months, yet in reality what must have only been seconds. I felt a rush of energy shove me suddenly, and yet it took its time to reach me nonetheless. It rushed around me like a gray ocean wave crashing into rock, and oozed onto me like slow melting candle wax. I tumbled backwards thrice, then found balance. I drifted on, trying to shake off the cold. I could hear massive beings float around me. Deep silent sighs of the ancient beasts sent me flying in multiple directions for what felt like eternity. I tried to circulate magic through my body, but found only emptiness. Nothing on the inside, no fire to tap from. I felt like any moment could be my last, when suddenly a great beast opened its unfathomable wide jaws and sneezed. Spinning away rapidly covered in dark gray snot was not fun. I smashed through some kind of liquid wall and slammed into hard dirt, dislodging my shoulder. It healed before I could even notice the pain.
"Intruder! Halt! In the name of our queen! Halt!"
The tip of a spear pressed against my jugular. I glared up to see what appeared to be a man. However, I could smell the beast. The beast inside me roared with the urge to attack and prove superiority, a trait my people never developed before me. They always saw the humans as food, but never took more than needed. They always gave riches and gifts to the families that lost loved ones. It was fair, kind, and foolish. They shouldn't have helped the weaker species become stronger, more intelligent, and yet they continued to give more and more. I fought the urge and stuffed the beast down. It had been a long while since I'd allowed myself to turn into that creature. The pain was numb now. "I come willingly, but I must ask the name of your queen." The soldier considered me for a moment. He took a deep breath of air, and his eyes widened.
"Queen Tahori? You share her blood?"
He didn't need an answer. He already knew, but he couldn't believe it. He took into his palm a green smoke, and suddenly Tahari showed her beautiful face.
"My queen, I have a prisoner that shares your blood."
Rage flashed over Tahari's face, and for a split second her face morphed into the beast. "Take him to the cages. He fights like the other prisoners," she said without hesitation.
"Prisoner? Hold for a moment. I'm not your prisoner, Tahari. I demand we speak."
My sentence was cut off by a spear shaft smacking into my throat. I gagged and fell to my knees. Before I could recover, the soldier injected a needle into my neck. Blood dripped to the ground slowly. The second drop suspended in the air for much longer than it should.
"No one makes demands of the queen. Enjoy the cage, dog."
I lost my grip on reality and slipped into the madness of my nightmares. It reminded me of the seeds of prophecy Tahari had fed me in her cottage. Tahari had been desperate for answers. It didn't matter how much psychological damage it had caused me, the nightmares I had suffered through since becoming the creature. The physical pain alone had been maddening enough. Worst of all was that I was in the same place once again, at her mercy on an unknown substance. This new substance burning into my system was much stronger. I wondered in my last moment of sanity if this time my mind would shatter. I awoke to the sound of a deep, dreadful drum. It pounded like the heartbeat of a monstrous beast. I felt it rush through me like my own heartbeat amplified by 1,000,000. Why was it so loud? Why did it rip apart my mind with such agony? Why wouldn't someone stop the drum? Then I realized that I was in complete silence. The world was gone, or rather lost in the depths of those caverns that my mind refuses to let go of. I fought the fall with all my might and found at last that my might was not enough. I learned then that my grip on reality had faded completely. I found my way through this murky madness and found bliss, only for a moment, and it was a grateful bliss, but it was soon lost, and I was falling,
always falling to the next field of darkness. The caverns never ended. They went on and on and on and on and on into the darkest of the most unspeakable places in creation. The sun was lost as well in those caverns, I was sure. I was positive if I went deep enough I'd find the sun. I wanted it for my own, to keep me warm as I lost my very being. I wanted to cast myself in those caverns, those empty caverns, those caverns overflowing with empty promises and nightmares, those caverns where every eye stares at me endlessly, and I with nothing to do but stare back. I broke through stone, and I found the sun. I found my escape. I jumped in and burned myself away. I didn't want to open my eyes yet. I had just found my way back from a heavy hallucinogen, with a pounding headache. I smelled the air and found only dried filth and hay. Every inch of my body was sore. I was still a vampire. I don't know why the thought kept running through my mind, but when I looked down and I saw my bestial form, I knew it wasn't true, and that I had lost control. The fight for dominance had finally tipped. Beasts don't dream, so the side of me that did had nothing but nightmares to compensate for the tainted blood flowing through my veins. I regretted the blood many more times, but none more than at that point. Fighting that internal war, both types of blood fighting for the control, until I couldn't hold it anymore. I gave it all I had, and it wasn't enough. The beast took hold.